A girl from a home like that isn't going to make it. The guidance counselor said it with her office door half open. Gus Sutter's 14-year-old daughter was sitting in the hallway. She heard every word. She was old enough to understand what the woman meant, and young enough to wonder whether she should believe her. 6 years later, Gus still carried the signed recommendation folded behind Della's school photograph. That night, the woman who had written it stood beneath the lights of the county hospital education hall. She was holding the foundation's highest student honor, and she was about to place it on Della Sutter. She had not recognized the father yet. She had not recognized the daughter. But Gus recognized her before she said her first word. And as Vivian Crane began speaking about children who came from homes without enough structure, Gus put one hand over the old letter in his pocket. Gus had cooked at the same roadside diner for 22 years. He worked the flat-top grill through breakfast, lunch, and most evenings. He raised Della alone after her mother left when the girl was 9. During dinner rush, Della did her homework in the corner booth beneath the pie case. Gus could not help much with chemistry. He could keep her coffee warm. He could bring her a plate after closing. And when she fell asleep over a textbook, he could carry the book home under his arm. He had never considered himself an educated man. When teachers spoke, he listened. When the school sent forms, he signed them. When guidance counselor Vivian Crane called him in during Della's freshman year, he wore the clean blue shirt he saved for parent meetings. Della had asked to enter the school's advanced science track. Vivian called the request ambitious. Then she spoke about stability. She spoke about realistic outcomes. She said demanding programs required support that some homes could not provide. Gus asked whether she meant his home. Vivian did not answer directly. She said her responsibility was to protect students from avoidable failure. 2 weeks later, Gus requested a review of Della's school file. Della was still 14, and he was still the parent responsible for the record. Inside was a signed recommendation from Vivian Crane. Her circumstances make success in a demanding program unlikely. I cannot recommend advancement at this time. The school eventually allowed Della into the course after a science teacher appealed the decision. Gus kept a copy of the recommendation. He never showed it to his daughter. He paid for a tutor by taking Sunday breakfast shifts. He learned to sleep in pieces. There were nights when he opened the letter after Della went to bed, not because he agreed with it, because he was afraid the counselor might know something he did not. Then Della would come through the diner door talking about blood flow, oxygen exchange, or the chambers of the heart, and Gus would fold the paper again. The letter said unlikely. Della kept behaving as though unlikely were not a verdict. The nursing pinning ceremony filled the county hospital's education hall. 200 folding chairs faced a low stage. Silver nursing pins rested on dark velvet beside a second, smaller case containing the foundation honor. Della sat in the front row with the graduating class. Gus sat 4 rows behind her in the same clean blue shirt, now faded at the collar. The program dean, Dr. Lorna Beckett, opened the ceremony. She had supervised the clinical faculty and approved the class rankings. When she announced that the foundation honor would go to the student who finished first, Della lowered her head. She already knew the name that would be called. Gus did not. Then Dr. Beckett introduced Vivian Crane. Vivian had retired from the school district and become chair of the Scholarship Foundation. She walked to the podium with one hand resting beside the honor pin. Her hair had gone silver. Her voice had not changed. Our foundation, she began, was created for students who begin without the advantages others take for granted. She spoke about unstable homes, parents with limited education, young people who needed institutions to supply the structure missing from their families. The words were polished. No single sentence sounded cruel. That made them worse. A few people nodded. Gus watched Della's fingers close around the edge of her program. Vivian looked down at the card prepared for her. For this year's recipient, she said, ability was never the problem. She read the name silently before saying it aloud. Della Sutter. Her eyes lifted. They found Della first. Then they moved past her and stopped on Gus. For less than a second, the gracious expression slipped. She remembered. But the microphone was live. The room was waiting, and Vivian Crane continued. Della's success, she said, recovering, shows what can happen when ability is finally met with the support it deserves. This time, Della looked directly at her. Gus felt the folded paper through his pocket. He could take it out. He could put Vivian's words beside the life sitting in the front row. But it was Della's ceremony. Her name was on the program. Her instructors were there. Her classmates had survived clinical mornings, exams, and 12-hour rotations beside her. Gus did not want the room to remember an argument instead of her achievement. His hand moved away from his pocket. Vivian turned toward the velvet case. For 1 second, Gus decided to let her finish. Then Della looked back at him. She did not nod. She did not ask him to stand. She only looked at him with the same guarded expression she had worn in school offices when adults discussed her future as though she were not in the room. Gus understood what silence would purchase. The ceremony would remain comfortable, and Vivian's version of their life would become the public version. Gus stood. He did not interrupt with a shout. He stepped into the aisle with the folded paper in his hand. The movement caught Dr. Beckett's attention. Della turned fully in her chair. Vivian stopped speaking. "Mr. Sutter," the dean said. Gus looked at his daughter before he answered. "I don't want to take her moment." His voice was quiet, but the microphone carried the silence around it. "I only want the words being used about her tonight to include the words that were used when she was 14. He walked to the small table beside the stage, rather than taking the podium. He opened the letter beneath the reading lamp. "This is the copy I received when I reviewed her school file." Then he looked at Vivian. "You wrote this about her." He placed one finger beneath the signature. "I kept it." He stepped back. No accusation followed, no speech, only the paper. Vivian looked down. The photographer near the center aisle lowered his camera. One of the instructors stopped turning the page of her program. The sound of paper moving through the hall disappeared unevenly, row by row. Dr. Beckett came down from the stage. She did not pick up the letter immediately. She looked at Della. "This concerns your school record," she said. "Do you want it read?" The question changed the room. For 6 years, adults had spoken about Della while she waited outside doors. Now every person in the hall waited for her. Della stood. "Yes," she said. She walked to the table and looked at the letter for the first time. Her eyes moved across the handwriting. Gus watched her reach the sentence he had carried alone. She did not cry. She placed the page back beneath the light. "You may write it," she told the dean. Dr. Beckett turned to Vivian. "Before I do, is that your signature?" Vivian's eyes remained on the page. "Yes." The word barely reached the microphone, but it reached the room. Dr. Beckett read only the relevant lines. "Her circumstances make success in a demanding program unlikely. I cannot recommend advancement at this time." She stopped. No one needed the rest. Vivian reached for the edge of the podium. "That recommendation reflected the information available to me then." Gus said nothing. Della said nothing. The defense had to stand on its own. Dr. Beckett returned to the stage and opened the ceremony citation already prepared before Gus rose. Tonight's recipient completed the program first in her class. She passed her licensing examination on her first attempt. She was selected by her instructors to represent the graduating cohort. These facts were established before anyone in this room saw that letter. She closed the folder. Then Della stepped toward the microphone. She did not look angry. That unsettled Vivian more than anger would have. You said my home could not give me what this future required. Vivian looked at her. Della continued. My father could not teach me organic chemistry. He made sure I had somewhere to study it. He could not tell me which college forms mattered. He sat beside me while I filled out every one. He did not have the education you thought I needed at home. He gave me the reason not to quit. Vivian's face changed slowly, not into defeat, into recognition. She looked at Gus's faded collar, at the old creases in the letter, at the woman in white standing between them. What I wrote was wrong, she said. Her voice was no longer the foundation voice. I treated the limits of my own expectations as though they were the limits of your ability. She paused, and what I said tonight about your home was wrong too. No applause came. Not yet. The correction was too fresh for celebration, but the woman who had controlled the story no longer controlled it. Dr. Beckett lifted the official nursing pin. Della Sutter. Della turned toward the stage. The ceremony continued. That mattered. The letter did not replace her achievement. It could no longer diminish it either. The dean pinned Della as a graduate nurse. Then she lifted the foundation honor. Vivian had been scheduled to place it. She looked at Della before moving. May I? Della held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. Vivian stepped forward and fixed the honor pin beside the first. Her hands trembled once. When she stepped away, she did not reach for the microphone again. Dr. Beckett read Della's name and the room rose. Not for Gus, not against Vivian, for the graduate whose name had survived both women's sentences about her. After the ceremony, the hall emptied slowly. Della found Gus beside the table where the old letter still lay. She folded it along the worn creases. Then she took a small pin from her pocket. It was not silver. It was a cheap enamel diner mug she had ordered herself. Across it were two tiny words, First Shift. She pressed it through the fabric above Gus's shirt pocket, the same pocket where the letter had ridden for 6 years. What's this for? He asked. For the person who always started before I did. She put the folded letter in his hand. Gus looked down at it. For years, that paper had felt heavier than anything in his wallet. Now it weighed exactly what it was. One page, one signature, one woman's mistake. He folded it once more, but he did not put it back behind Della's photograph. He handed it to her. Della slipped it into the ceremony folder beneath the 2 pins she had earned, not to carry the verdict, to keep the correction. Then she took her father's arm and walked with him out of the hall. Would you have protected the ceremony by staying quiet? Or placed the letter under the light? And what should matter more when judging a child's future? The home's credentials, or the love that refuses to let her quit?